Racist passenger refuses to sit next to black woman, but she's an undercover FBI agent protecting the flight. They say real character is revealed when tensions run high. On a bustling morning at Los Angeles International Airport, the unthinkable happens. A passenger indignantly refuses to sit next to an African-American woman. Tempers flare, accusations fly, and a silent crowd looks on, unsure how to react. Little does anyone know, that very woman is no ordinary traveler. She's an undercover FBI agent on a critical mission to safeguard the entire flight. Through unexpected twists and hair-raising suspense, justice and karma deliver a stunning comeback you'll never forget. Prepare yourself for a journey where prejudice faces its reckoning and hidden heroism takes center stage. Brian Campbell was a man who thrived on routine and predictability. Middle-aged and opinionated, he'd spent the better part of his professional life as an accountant in Orange County. Regular flights to the East Coast for conferences were just part of his work week, the kind of minor inconvenience he tolerated in exchange for a steady paycheck. On this particular morning at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, however, Brian was on edge. He was already running late thanks to a massive traffic jam on the 405 freeway. He had only managed a single cup of coffee, which did nothing to soothe his irritability. Rushing through the bustling airport, he checked in at the Delta Airlines counter, where the agents, swamped with travelers, all wore polite but tired smiles. Brian felt a twinge of frustration when he discovered his seat assignment might not be the aisle seat he usually requested. Traffic, crowds, and the tiny detail of a seat location his entire day seemed stacked against him. He grumbled under his breath, wishing he could manage a private flight or just call into the meeting instead of flying across the country for another tedious event. Meanwhile, across the terminal, Special Agent Jessica Matthews moved with a composed grace that belied her importance. Jessica was a seasoned FBI operative out of the Los Angeles field office, but nobody would have guessed it by looking at her. Dressed casually in jeans and a lightweight jacket, she appeared to be just another traveler. The only giveaway to her real profession was a small, discreet earpiece she wore, and even that was almost imperceptible. She was on a high-stakes mission that demanded she remain inconspicuous while traveling. A tip had come in from an informant the night before, suggesting a potential threat on this very flight heading to New York City. Protocol demanded that an undercover agent be on board to assess any potential danger. Jessica was that agent. She waited in line for the security check, keenly observing everyone around her. You could never be too careful, especially when credible intel hinted at a possible terror-related attempt. A man with a bulging backpack, a young mother juggling a stroller and carry-on, a pair of well-dressed businessmen. Jessica studied them all quietly, ticking mental checklists as she went. She had been in the FBI for nearly 10 years, specializing in counter-terrorism. She knew every nuance of suspicious behavior, the subtle glances, the micro-expressions, the tension in a person's hands or their shifting stance. At the gate, Brian Campbell arrived breathless, glaring at his boarding pass. Seat 17B, only 2 rows away from first class, but still economy. He hated not having the aisle seat. He needed the room to stretch out, or so he always claimed. His sense of entitlement and impatience were dialed up to maximum volume this morning. On any other day, his annoyance might have simmered quietly, but on this day it would spark the flames of a deeper, far more consequential confrontation, a confrontation that would test the limits of empathy, justice, and personal decency. Little did Brian know that in only a matter of minutes, his frustration over a seat assignment would collide with Jessica Matthews' carefully orchestrated operation. The stage was set at Gate 32B, Delta Flight 1045 to John F. Kennedy International Airport, JFK. Two travelers, one consumed by petty irritations, and the other quietly preparing for a threat that could endanger every soul aboard that plane, were about to cross paths in a way that neither could possibly anticipate. Boarding began promptly, and both Brian and Jessica found themselves in the second call. People formed a neat, snaking line that advanced every few seconds as the gate agents scanned boarding passes. Jessica stood in silence, her focus shifting from the anxious faces of fellow passengers to the flight crew. She kept a mental log of names, seat assignments, and even overheard snippets of conversation, all while wearing a warm, approachable smile. Brian was a few passengers behind her, staring at his phone to distract himself. He had half a mind to purchase an upgrade at the last second, but it was too late. The gate agents were already scanning tickets. He resigned himself to seat 17B, forced to stew in his own discontent. As Jessica stepped onto the jet bridge, she felt the buzz of adrenaline. Traveling undercover came with its own set of challenges. Every individual around her could be a potential ally, a harmless bystander, or the very threat she was sent to intercept. She was careful to keep her expression neutral yet friendly, so nobody would suspect she was anything more than a woman on a business trip, albeit with an exceptionally watchful demeanor. Once in the cabin, the flight attendants greeted her with standard professional courtesy. Jessica gave them a polite nod, scanning the seat rows. The plane smelled of recycled air, industrial cleaner, and the faint aroma of coffee from the galley. Her seat was 17A, the window seat. In that moment, she felt a pang of irony. An FBI agent with a vantage point of the sky, ironically pinned in by the window. But a seat was a seat. Her job was to be where she needed to be, no matter the comfort. She quickly stored her carry-on in the overhead bin. It contained only a few personal items and a hidden lockbox that shielded her sidearm. She'd been given special clearance to carry her weapon. After all, in a worst-case scenario, she might need it. She settled into her seat, plugged her earpiece cord discreetly beneath her jacket collar, and took a deep, calming breath. A short time later, Brian entered the same row. He fiddled with his own carry-on, pushing and cramming it until it fit into the overhead bin. Then he glanced down at the seat next to Jessica. Without a single courteous smile, nod, or greeting, he slumped into seat 17B, exhaling heavily as though the world owed him an apology. Jessica gave him a polite nod, an acknowledgement of shared space, but he barely acknowledged her in return. Moments passed. The aisle seat, 17C, remained vacant for now, but not for long. Passengers were still trickling in, each scanning the rows for their seat number. A short line formed in the aisle as people tried to stow bags and settle. Brian leaned into his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. Jessica returned her attention to the aisle, scanning faces for that flicker of suspicion or anxiety that might indicate someone with ulterior motives. When the occupant of seat 17C finally arrived, an older woman with silver hair and a gentle smile, Brian bristled. He had hoped the seat might remain empty for extra elbow room. His face betrayed every ounce of annoyance as she apologized her way into seat 17C. He turned back toward Jessica, a slight sneer curling his lips, as though somehow the arrangement of seat assignments was her fault. In that instant, tension buzzed in the air, like static electricity. And though Jessica was still in the dark about the confrontation that was about to erupt, she felt the first stirrings of something, of some intangible friction that started with Brian's unwelcoming posture. The flight attendant at the front announced final boarding. Doors would soon close. Jessica mentally recounted the number of passengers she'd seen board. Everyone appeared more or less ordinary. She wondered if the tip had been exaggerated or if the real threat was something more subtle. Either way, her mission was to remain alert and ready for whatever might unfold. Little did she know, the first threat to reveal itself wouldn't be a terrorist suspect, but the man seated directly beside her, a man whose prejudice was about to boil over. Delta Flight 1045 had just begun to taxi away from the gate when it happened. The older woman in seat 17C leaned over to speak to Brian, politely asking if he could hold her cup for a moment while she reached for something in her bag. Brian, caught off guard by the request, reluctantly took the cup. He glared at her for an instant, as though he considered the gesture a personal affront. Then, as he passed it back, he muttered an audible complaint about cramped seats and inconsiderate neighbors. Jessica, half listening, tried to dismiss it. She had more pressing concerns than a rude seatmate. But then Brian turned his frustrations squarely on her. Perhaps it was her quiet calm, or her status as a black woman, or just a reflection of his general disdain for anyone he deemed inconvenient. He angled his body away, grimacing, and mumbled something under his breath that instantly froze Jessica in her seat. "I can't believe I got stuck next to a black woman," Brian said, though quietly enough that most of the cabin didn't hear it. But Jessica did. Her heart pounded, not out of fear but anger. She'd encountered prejudice before, but rarely so blatant in a modern public setting. Brian's words cut through the pre-flight murmur like a sharp blade. She forced herself to remain composed, to remember her training. Confronting him openly might risk blowing her cover. Still, the wave of offense crashed over her, and she needed a moment to steady her own response. The older lady in seat 17C either didn't hear him or chose to ignore it. Jessica made a measured decision: do not engage. She couldn't afford a scene that would draw the attention of the entire aircraft, including any possible suspects. Maintaining anonymity was critical. Yet a sense of justice burned in her gut. She wanted to call him out, to not allow his hatefulness to go unchecked. Brian continued, louder this time, perhaps testing how far he could push it. "These airlines just don't listen, do they? You pay good money, and they seat you next to someone you'd rather not be around." The subtle hush that fell over that section of the cabin was unmistakable. Heads turned. Jessica, on alert, noticed a flight attendant glance their way. The older lady in seat 17C looked mortified, color draining from her cheeks. She tried to calm Brian. "Sir, please. We're just about to take off. Let's not make a scene." But Brian was already on a roll. "I'm not making a scene, I'm stating a fact. I'm not comfortable here, and I'm certainly not comfortable next to her," he spat, pointing at Jessica with an air of entitlement. "I'm asking for another seat." Jessica closed her eyes briefly, inhaling. The scenario was rapidly escalating. She saw other passengers craning their necks, hearing the nastiness of Brian's words. A child, 2 rows back, asked her mother in a loud whisper, "Why is he mad?" That child's innocent query cut deeper than any insult. This was the reality of prejudice, unfolding in a captive space at 17B, for everyone to witness. The flight attendant arrived, forced smile in place. "Is there a problem here?" Brian seized the moment. "Yes, actually. I've got a problem with my seat. I'd like to move. I refuse to sit next to her." The flight attendant's gaze moved from Brian to Jessica, confusion etched across her face. She blinked, as if not quite believing what she'd heard. She looked at Jessica apologetically, then turned back to Brian. "Sir, the flight is full. We're preparing for takeoff. Unfortunately, there's no place to move you." Brian, determined to have his way, made a show of scanning the cabin. "What about first class?" "I'd pay extra, if that's what it takes." "I'm sorry, sir," the attendant replied, her professional tone strained. "First class is also completely booked. If you could please remain seated." At that moment, Jessica felt her phone vibrate subtly in her jacket pocket, likely a coded message from the small earpiece or a text from an FBI colleague. There was no time to check it. She needed to stay calm, keep her composure, and ensure her presence remained low-key. Brian, however, was not finished. I'm not staying in a seat next to some person who makes me uncomfortable. I have rights. I'm calling the airline. This is unacceptable. The flight attendant stood firm, though her eyes betrayed the stress of the situation. Sir, if this continues, we'll have to consider removing you from the aircraft. We cannot depart if a passenger is being disruptive and refusing to comply with crew instructions. In that moment, Jessica wondered if Brian would be escorted off, effectively removing him as a distraction to her real mission. But then, a quiet tension settled. Everyone was waiting, watchful. Finally, Brian acquiesced, albeit begrudgingly. Fine, but don't think I'm letting this go. The flight attendant turned away, relief flickering across her features. Jessica stared straight ahead, her heart still hammering in her chest, though her face remained stoic. She was no stranger to hostility. She'd faced down violent criminals, extremists, people who truly wanted to do her harm. Yet the sting of racism, delivered so casually, always carried a different weight. And this was only the beginning. Once the plane soared into the sky, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. The flight attendants busied themselves with the seatbelt sign announcements and safety reminders. Jessica felt a subtle shift in air pressure as the aircraft descended. The entire time she was acutely aware of Brian's presence on her right. His shoulders were tense, and he seemed to take up more space than he actually occupied, as if building an invisible wall of hostility. Jessica discreetly checked the message on her phone. It was from her contact at the FBI, confirming that a known extremist had purchased a ticket for this flight but had not shown up at the gate. The text read, "Possible lead was a no-show. Stay alert anyway. Could be second party." Jessica's eyes narrowed. A second party? That meant someone else might be on board to carry out a plan. Her adrenaline spiked. The tip hadn't been false. There might still be an active threat in the cabin. She glanced around, scanning faces again, looking for that spark of anxiety or suspicion that could indicate someone on edge. A tall man with a sweat-drenched collar sat a few rows ahead, fidgeting with the in-flight magazine. Another passenger kept glancing at his watch nervously. None of it was unusual, though fear of flying and pre-travel jitters were common. But Jessica would continue to watch like a hawk, determined not to miss a single detail. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Brian typing furiously on his phone. The plane's Wi-Fi had just been enabled for those who paid for the service. She wondered if he was venting on social media about his unacceptable seatmate. People with bigotry often sought echo chambers to validate their hateful views. Or perhaps he was complaining to the airline. Jessica let out a silent exhale, reminding herself that he was not her primary mission, just a despicable man who needed a lesson in empathy. Yet fate, or karma, had other plans. A flight attendant came by with beverage service. Brian snatched a can of soda off the cart, refusing to look at Jessica or the older lady in seat 17C. When the cart moved on, the older lady leaned over timidly, whispering to Jessica, "I'm so sorry you have to endure this. It's not right." Jessica forced a small smile, touched by the woman's concern. "I'll be okay," she replied softly. "Thank you for your kindness." The flight settled into a routine lull, the hum of engines, low conversations, and the occasional cough or clink of ice in plastic cups. Jessica knew better than to relax completely, though. She kept her posture casual, but her mind raced with possible threat scenarios. Could it be someone in the back, waiting for the right moment? Or maybe a duo coordinating? She remembered her training. Keep your guard up, but don't tip your hand. Brian sighed dramatically and began watching a movie on his phone. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, but for a moment it seemed the conflict might temporarily rest. Jessica turned her gaze to the window, looking at the endless blue sky. She thought of her mentors at the bureau, her family in Chicago who believed wholeheartedly in her mission to make the world a safer place. She couldn't let Brian's prejudice distract her from doing her job. Still, the next steps of the flight loomed uncertain. The terror tip, the strange no-show of the original suspect, and now an implied second threat. Jessica had a simmering suspicion that the flight might not remain peaceful for long. It was only a matter of time before hidden motives came to the surface and the real fight began. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt sign flickered on again, indicating mild turbulence ahead. Passengers stirred from half-sleep, adjusting their seats. Jessica took the opportunity to stretch her legs briefly, excusing herself past Brian, who grimaced, as though merely brushing shoulders with her was repugnant. She walked to the restroom at the back of the plane, using the short corridor near the galley to collect her thoughts. An unspoken tension existed in the rows behind her. She could sense it. Her instincts as an agent honed in on subtle details. A man repeatedly checking the overhead bin, a passenger flipping through photos on a phone with what looked like schematics. Her mind flickered with possibilities. Was it harmless, or a prelude to something more sinister? But as she lingered by the galley, the flight attendant from earlier approached her in hushed tones. "Ma'am, I just want to apologize again for that man's behavior," she said, a sincere furrow in her brow. "If there was any way to move him or you, I would. But the flight is absolutely packed." Jessica nodded, her voice calm. "I understand. It's not your fault. Thanks for checking in." Part of her wanted to reveal her FBI credentials to ensure no further trouble from Brian, but that would compromise her cover. She resisted the urge. The flight attendant sighed, glancing toward the cabin. "He's been complaining non-stop. I'm worried it's only going to escalate. We have rules about disruptive passengers, and if he crosses a certain line..." Jessica offered a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine. Don't worry about me." She left it at that, not wanting to draw further attention. With a polite nod, Jessica returned to her seat, weaving around a few passengers who were also stretching their legs. Upon approaching row 17, she noticed Brian rummaging through the seat back pocket, scowling at the in-flight magazine. He was so engrossed in his frustration, he barely noticed Jessica return. She sat down, buckled her seatbelt, and tried to refocus on the potential threat. If something was about to happen, it would likely occur during a moment of less scrutiny perhaps, when the cabin lights dimmed for the in-flight meal, or when the majority of passengers were napping. Minutes later, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The aircraft jolted, overhead bins rattled. Some passengers gasped, clutching armrests. Jessica's heartbeat quickened out of instinct, but she quickly assessed it was standard turbulence. Still, the jolt drew her attention to a man across the aisle, a passenger in seat 18D. He had a laptop open, and in that moment, Jessica glimpsed what looked like a series of complex lines and boxes displayed on the screen. It could be architectural plans or software flowcharts, but her mind considered darker possibilities. She carefully leaned over, trying to see more without looking obvious. The man turned slightly, hiding the screen from her view. Her pulse quickened. Meanwhile, Brian fidgeted beside her, muttering about the turbulence. Then his phone chimed with a notification. He snatched it up, read the screen, and let out a gruff "huh." Jessica couldn't help but wonder who he was talking to and what was fueling his ongoing hostility. She tried to ignore him, but his presence was an incessant drip of annoyance in the back of her mind. As the plane steadied, Jessica's attention snapped back to the man with the laptop, who was now scribbling something in a small notebook. The hush of the cabin felt pregnant with anticipation. Her training told her to remain patient sometimes. The biggest clue was letting the suspect believe no one was watching. She took a breath, forced herself to relax her shoulders, and placed her hand discreetly near her jacket pocket where her phone was. She considered the older lady in 17C, who was half asleep, her head bobbing gently. Brian shifted in his seat. The flight felt both unbearably long and blink of an eye short when weighed against the potential for a sudden crisis. Jessica prayed, in her own silent way, that the threat was nothing more than rumor. But her gut told her otherwise. A storm was coming. She just didn't know if it would strike from 18D, from some unknown passenger in the back, or from the vile man already causing turmoil right next to her. The in-flight meal service finally commenced. Flight attendants, wheeling carts laden with hot trays, asked passengers their choice of chicken or pasta. Jessica opted for the chicken, hoping a bit of protein might steady her nerves. Brian impatiently mumbled a request for the pasta, complaining loudly that the airline always served bland food. The older woman in seat 17C politely declined a meal, stating she had her own snacks. Halfway through the meal, Jessica noticed the man with the laptop, seat 18D, heading toward the restroom at the front of the plane, notebook in hand. Her intuition flared. She had to follow, but carefully. She excused herself yet again, stepping around Brian's legs. He glared at her as though she were an insect. She ignored it. Moving forward, Jessica pretended to be on her own trip to the lavatory. The man with the notebook was indeed heading that way. The line for the lavatories near the cockpit was typically shorter, especially during meal service. Jessica approached casually, as if impatient to use the facilities. The man in 18D turned around momentarily, locking eyes with her. She forced a casual smile, which he returned with a curt nod. He then slipped into the forward lavatory, door clicking shut behind him. Jessica leaned against the bulkhead, silently cursing the limitations of airplane architecture. She couldn't follow him inside, and she certainly couldn't stand around looking suspicious. She waited. A minute passed, then two. Finally, the door clicked open. The man stepped out, carefully tucking his notebook back into his jacket. Their eyes met again, and she noticed he was breathing slightly heavier than before. Nervousness? Jessica couldn't be sure. He passed by, his gaze darting momentarily to her jacket, where her phone was partially visible. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition of some kind. Jessica's heart thudded. Did he suspect her? Before she could speak or make a move, another passenger stepped into the tight aisle, blocking Jessica's path. By the time she maneuvered around them, the man had returned to his seat. Jessica debated following him right away, but decided that drawing attention to herself would be risky. She pulled out her phone, typing a quick note to her FBI contact, "Man in 18D, suspicious monitoring." On her way back to row 17, she ran into a small commotion. One of the flight attendants was trying to maneuver the meal cart back up the aisle, but Brian was complaining yet again. "This cart is blocking the aisle," he griped. "I need to get to the overhead bin." The flight attendant responded courteously, "Sir, I'll move it in just a moment. Could you please return to your seat until we finish collecting trays?" Brian bristled, raising his voice. "Why do I keep getting told to wait? I've had enough of this flight's nonsense." "First, I'm forced to sit next to—" He caught sight of Jessica returning. "Her," he spat venomously, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "and now I can't even get into my own bag. This is ridiculous." A couple of passengers turned in their seats, eyebrows raised. The flight attendant tried to pacify him. "Sir, we'll be done in just a minute. Please calm down." Brian clenched his fists, letting out a harsh breath, then stomped back to row 17. Jessica arrived behind him. "Let's not hold up the aisle, please," she said calmly, careful to keep her tone neutral so as not to provoke him. In reality, she was close to losing her composure, but letting Brian's animosity escalate further risked overshadowing the real threat she suspected loomed behind them. Once seated again, Brian continued to mutter under his breath, while Jessica carefully stowed her phone. She glanced at 18D, who was now fiddling with his seatbelt. His expression remained neutral, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. She silently rehearsed how she would approach him if needed quietly, asserting her authority only if absolutely necessary. Moments later, the flight attendant removed the trays in row 17. Jessica forced a small thanks. Brian said nothing. The older woman in seat 17C looked at Jessica sympathetically, as if silently apologizing for being a helpless bystander. Jessica offered a kind nod to reassure her. Meanwhile, thoughts raced through Jessica's mind about how to balance the immediate, tangible hostility from Brian with the intangible, potentially dangerous actions of the man in 18D. The plane rocked slightly with another mild jolt of turbulence. A few overhead compartments clicked, seat belts rattled, and the seatbelt sign blinked back on. Jessica's pulse quickened. Something told her this flight was about to take an even sharper turn. With the seatbelt sign illuminated once again, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, advising passengers to remain seated. Some people pressed their faces to the windows, marveling at the cloud formations. Others tried to calm themselves by focusing on in-flight entertainment. But Jessica scanned the cabin, searching for any sign of agitation that seemed out of place. She noticed the man in 18D glancing repeatedly at the seat 2 rows ahead of him, 16F, where a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse sat quietly reading. Was there a connection between them? Jessica watched carefully, but there was no overt interaction, just subtle, repeated looks, like he was keeping track of her for some reason. At the same time, a text lit up Jessica's phone. Possible device on board. Unknown subject. Keep eyes open. Jessica's heart pounded. A device? Bomb? Biological agent? The message was vague, but enough to raise her alert to critical levels. She discreetly replied, investigating possible suspects. Will inform. Suddenly, Brian nudged Jessica with his elbow harder than a polite gesture. Hey, he snarled. If you're going to keep texting, could you at least not crowd my armrest? Jessica bit her tongue, resisting the urge to snap back. Brian had no idea the urgency behind her messages, nor how deeply she wanted to see him put in his place. I'm not crowding, she said calmly. Please keep your elbow to yourself, he scoffed. Unbelievable. People like you have no respect. You think everything revolves around your phone. You people are all the same. Jessica felt the sting of his insinuation, but tried to remain neutral. I'm just minding my own business, sir. Kindly do the same. Brian opened his mouth to retort, but the flight attendant passed by, and he seemed to think better of causing another scene. He clenched his jaw, muttering something indecipherable under his breath. Jessica glanced away, thoughts racing. She realized that she needed to keep an eye on 18D more than ever, but Brian's constant antagonism was making it hard to focus. A new wave of turbulence shook the plane. Stronger this time, the overhead compartments rattled and the cabin lights flickered. Jessica's body tensed. The man in 18D quickly closed his laptop, as if startled. The seatbelt sign remained on, so no one was allowed to get up. If someone intended to place or activate a device, they might wait until the turbulence subsided or the seatbelt sign switched off. Across the aisle, Jessica saw a flight attendant walk toward the front, whispering anxiously to another crew member. She caught snippets of their conversation, phrases like unruly passenger and check row 17. Her eyes narrowed, suspecting they were discussing Brian's conduct. The older woman in 17C placed a hand gently on Jessica's arm. She spoke quietly so Brian wouldn't hear. Dear, I'm so sorry. I never dreamed I'd see such hateful behavior in this day and age. If you need me to say anything to the flight attendants about him, I will. Jessica was touched by the woman's compassion. She covered the woman's hand with her own, nodding. Thank you. I'll be all right. She wanted to tell the woman to stay vigilant, that there might be real danger beyond bigotry lurking in the cabin, but she couldn't blow her cover. Another jolt of turbulence hit, causing the plane to dip momentarily. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Brian grabbed the armrest in a panic, knuckles white. Jessica steadied herself, her instincts flaring. The man in 18D jerked upright, glancing around as if evaluating whether this was the moment to act or remain still. Jessica's senses were at full throttle. She could almost feel the tension in the recycled air, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Though the plane stabilized a moment later, the seatbelt sign remained on, a testament to the flight deck's caution. Jessica prayed the pilot would steer them to smoother skies soon, but also recognized that if a threat was brewing, the turbulence might be the catalyst or the deterrent. Either way, she was bracing for the next move, be it from 18D or from Brian's hateful antics flaring again. After what felt like an eternity, the turbulence subsided. The captain announced smoother skies ahead. Jessica's eyes never left 18D. She noticed him tapping his foot nervously, glancing at his watch. Her mind cycled through potential scenarios. Was he waiting for a certain time to act? Was there an accomplice? She considered the possibility of a hidden weapon or a device stashed in a carry-on. The challenge was that almost any suspicious action could still be innocent. She needed more evidence before risking open confrontation. Meanwhile, Brian continued to stew beside her. He rummaged in the seat back pocket, pulled out a pen, scribbled on a napkin, then crumpled it up. Jessica caught a glimpse of scribbled phrases: complaint, customer service, racial discrimination. Ironic, Jessica thought, that he was the one being blatantly racist, yet was writing about discrimination as if he were the victim. Her jaw tightened, but she swallowed her anger. The older woman in 17C excused herself to use the restroom. As she slipped away, Brian pounced on the chance to verbally jab Jessica again. "You see what you've done?" he hissed. "You made this whole flight miserable for me. I'll be filing a formal complaint with Delta. People like you always playing the victim card, when really you're the problem." Jessica's chest burned. She was used to going undercover in tense, high-risk scenarios, but the emotional toll of direct, personal hatred was different. "Sir," she replied quietly, "I've done nothing to you. You're creating this entire conflict on your own." Brian's face reddened. "Don't try to lecture me. I'm not the one in the wrong here. I'm a paying customer who deserves respect." She inhaled slowly, forcing composure. "You don't earn respect by insulting others, especially not because of the color of their skin." For a moment, Brian glared at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. She wondered if he'd lash out physically. But then he turned away, crossing his arms like a petulant child. Jessica felt a surge of relief that it hadn't escalated further yet. She also felt the eyes of several nearby passengers upon them. Some looked sympathetic, others uncomfortable, and a few were simply curious about the unfolding drama. Then, a voice crackled over the plane speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been advised of some moderate turbulence ahead, so we'll need everyone to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." Almost immediately, the seatbelt sign pinged back on, and the flight attendants hurried to secure the galley. The older woman in 17C, returning from the lavatory, had to navigate past a row of anxious faces to reclaim her seat. Jessica realized with the seatbelt sign on, no one was going anywhere. If 18D or someone else planned to move about the cabin to plant or retrieve a device, they'd be forced to wait. This might offer Jessica a reprieve to observe carefully, or it might prompt the suspect to act anyway. Seatbelt sign be damned. The older woman sat down, exhaling with relief. "They closed off the aisle again," she said softly to Jessica. "It's getting rough out there." Jessica nodded, discreetly peering at 18D. He looked decidedly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, checking his watch again. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong with him, perhaps a plan delayed by the turbulence, or an anxious traveler waiting for the flight to end. Either way, Jessica readied herself for the next wave, whether it was from the elements or from human malice. A minute later, the plane lurched violently as it hit another pocket of rough air. Trays rattled and overhead bins shook. Brian gripped the seat in front of him, letting out a small yelp of surprise. Jessica remained calm. Fear was a distraction she could ill afford. For all the drama Brian had caused, she braced for the possibility that he might actually become even more unhinged under stress. And in the seat behind them, the suspected man in 18D might take advantage of the chaos for his own ends. They were thousands of feet in the air, reliant on the skill of the pilots and the stability of the aircraft. They had no place to run or hide. Jessica mentally steeled herself for the confrontation that could erupt at any moment. Tension was a tangible presence, as real as the cabin pressure that pressed everyone into their seats. Time seemed to stretch as they hurtled eastward through choppy skies, each second ticking closer to a reckoning that no one, least of all Brian, was prepared for. At last, the turbulence eased enough for the flight attendants to distribute beverages again. Jessica declined, wanting to keep her senses sharp. Brian took another soda, gulping it angrily like it had personally wronged him. The older woman in 17C sipped ginger ale. Soft murmurs returned to the cabin. Some passengers resumed watching movies or reading. Jessica's entire focus was on 18D, who tapped out a text on his phone, lines of worry etched on his forehead. Suddenly, he stood. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated, but he made his way toward the back of the plane, passing row 17. Jessica caught a glimpse of his phone screen, where a message read, "Wait for my signal," before he locked it. Adrenaline spiked in her system. A partner was definitely involved. She needed to follow him. She stood up, carefully stepping around Brian once again. "What now?" he spat, but she ignored him. Pretending to head to the restroom, Jessica slipped down the aisle. She found 18D in the narrow corridor near the rear lavatories, phone in hand. He had his back turned, but as she approached, the plane dipped briefly, causing her to stumble forward. The movement drew his attention. He pivoted sharply, their eyes locked. For the first time, Jessica sensed genuine alarm from him, like a cornered animal. She tried to project calmness. "Excuse me," she said, as if trying to squeeze past him. But in that split second, she saw him shove a hand into his jacket pocket, as though protecting something or preparing to use it. Her training instincts kicked in, but she also knew that revealing herself too soon could endanger everyone. She murmured softly, "Hey, is everything all right? You seem nervous." It was a calculated risk, approaching him directly. He blinked. "I'm fine," he snapped, stepping back. "Go. Use the lavatory if you need to." A flicker of panic crossed his face, quickly replaced by indignation. Jessica nodded apologetically, slipped into the lavatory. She locked the door, taking 2 deep breaths. Then she lifted her phone, typing a message with rapid precision. "Suspect has partner, possible device or weapon in jacket. Need backup at row 18. Might act soon." The text went to her FBI contact, who would hopefully relay it to flight officials. She prayed that she could intercept the threat before it materialized. When she emerged, the corridor was empty. She made her way back to her seat. The older woman in 17C looked relieved to see her, while Brian simply rolled his eyes. Jessica sat down, heart hammering. She took one quick scan around. 18D was back in his seat, phone on tray table, face taut with tension. Who was the partner? Could it be someone from first class, or even from the economy cabin who had yet to show any outward sign of collusion? Before she could consider further, Brian turned to her, voice low and aggressive. "You need to stop getting up every 5 minutes. You're interrupting my personal space." Unbelievable, Jessica thought, but forced a measured response. "I have the right to move when I need to." Brian let out a mirthless laugh. "Of course you'd say that. Typical." His voice dripped contempt. But Jessica no longer had the bandwidth to deal with his pettiness. A potential bomb or violent scheme was in play. She mentally debated revealing her badge just to silence him. Yet that could put everything in jeopardy. She remained silent, ignoring him. A subtle commotion from further up the cabin caught her eye. A flight attendant seemed to be quietly conferring with the older man in seat 15A. They were speaking in hushed tones, eyes darting behind them. Could that be the partner? Or was it an unrelated matter, perhaps a medical issue? Jessica's phone vibrated, a message from her contact. Crew alerted. Another agent on flight. Jessica blinked. She hadn't been informed of another agent being on board. Could her contact be referencing an air marshal? Possibly so. Jessica typed back, "No knowledge of additional agent. Will remain on alert." A swirl of uncertainty filled Jessica's mind. Brian's harassment, while infuriating, was now secondary to the bigger threat. Yet she knew from experience that small distractions often led to missed crucial details. She forced herself to remain calm, scanning for any sign of 18D or an accomplice preparing to move. The plane hummed with the quiet chatter of unsuspecting passengers. Time stretched in the stale cabin air. Was the real storm yet to come, or had the danger passed unfulfilled? As Jessica pondered her next move, Brian turned his head abruptly, trying to catch her attention. For a moment, she braced for another racist tirade, but his face wore a strange expression, almost fear. He leaned in and hissed, "What's going on back there?" He'd seen her looking. "You know something?" Caught off guard, Jessica hesitated. There was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, as if he'd begun to suspect she was more than just an ordinary passenger. The tension soared to a new level, because if Brian's bigotry and negativity weren't enough, now she had to worry about him guessing her identity and causing a bigger disruption. She steadied herself, preparing for the gauntlet that lay ahead. Jessica took a steadying breath, locking eyes with Brian. She knew the slightest misstep in how she answered could provoke him or tip him off. But a bigger thought loomed. With the flight possibly in danger, was it time to reveal herself? If a crisis erupted, her authority as an FBI agent might be the difference between containment and disaster. She replied calmly, "I don't know what you mean, sir. I'm just being observant." The words sounded weak, even to her own ears. Brian's face twisted in skepticism. Before he could press further, a voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for potential turbulence. We're anticipating another rough patch. Everyone, kindly remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Jessica decided to leverage the announcement to her advantage. She turned away from Brian, feigning a sense of finality in the conversation. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The older woman in 17C closed her eyes, clearly exhausted by the tension. Jessica scanned for 18D, but he was still in his seat, leaning toward the aisle, glancing at his phone. The plane began to shake again. It was modest turbulence, but enough to jolt the overhead bins. Jessica felt her adrenaline spike anew. If a suspect planned to strike, they might wait for a calmer moment. Or, if their nerves frayed, they might act impulsively in the midst of turbulence. She reached discreetly into her jacket, fingertips brushing against her concealed badge and the edges of her holstered firearm. The vow she'd taken as an agent to protect and defend echoed in her mind. Suddenly, Brian let out a startled gasp. He'd dropped his phone, and it skittered under the seat in front of him. Without thinking, he unclasped his seatbelt and lunged forward to retrieve it. The flight attendant, who happened to be walking by, immediately admonished him. "Sir, you need to remain seated. The seatbelt sign is on for your safety." Brian shot her a venomous glare, but sat back, muttering about incompetent airline staff. Jessica took the opportunity to pivot her torso, peering behind them to see if 18D was moving. He wasn't. But another passenger was standing near the galley, despite the seatbelt sign. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s. He was rummaging in the overhead compartment, ignoring the flight attendant's requests to sit down. Something about his demeanor pinged Jessica's intuition. Then a hush fell over the cabin as the plane gave a particularly strong shudder. A few overhead lights flickered. The tall man in the galley swayed, grabbing onto the overhead bin. In that moment, Jessica spotted 18D rising slightly from his seat, as though about to stand. Her pulse hammered. This could be it, some coordinated move. She tensed, waiting for the next instant, prepared to rise and intervene, if necessary. But the turbulence abruptly worsened, forcing both men to sit or risk toppling over. The seatbelt sign glowed ominously. Passengers gasped or gripped their armrests. Flight attendants hurriedly strapped themselves into their jump seats. Jessica felt the plane lurch sideways, the unsettling sensation of a sudden altitude drop. Within seconds, the commotion overshadowed any immediate attempt at sabotage. Brian's face went pale as he held onto the seat in front of him, eyes wide with fear. The older woman clutched the armrest, whispering a prayer. Jessica focused on staying calm, heart pounding with the dual threat of natural turbulence and potential violence. She could do nothing until the plane stabilized. Even then, would she have the chance to confront 18D? Or was the tall man by the galley the real partner? Everything seemed to hang in a precarious balance at 30,000 feet. Jessica's covert identity, Brian's hateful disruptions, and the looming possibility of a malicious act. As the aircraft rattled on through stormy skies, Jessica steeled herself for the moment the seatbelt sign dimmed and the real showdown began. At last, the turbulence eased and passengers let out shaky breaths of relief. Jessica kept watch on seat 18D, where her suspect rose halfway, adjusting his jacket. Nearby, Brian fretted over his dropped phone, still demanding flight attendant assistance, oblivious to the real danger. A piercing electronic beep shattered the momentary calm. Jessica's pulse kicked into overdrive. Row 18 was the epicenter. One man rummaged in his carry-on, while another emerged from the galley, eyes locked on the device in his partner's hand. Wires dangled and fear rippled through the watching passengers. Sensing disaster, Jessica stepped into the aisle, drawing on her years of FBI training. "I need you both to remain calm," she commanded. One suspect snarled, "Who are you?" Jessica flipped open her badge. Federal agent, hands visible. A stunned hush gripped the cabin. Brian, the man who'd insulted Jessica only hours ago, froze in disbelief. Before anyone could react, the two suspects bolted toward the rear, sending trays and passengers stumbling. Jessica rushed after them, heart pounding, ready to confront a deadly threat at 30,000 feet, while the entire plane, Brian included, realized that the woman they had underestimated was their last line of defense. "Federal agent, stop!" Jessica's voice sliced through the clamor as the two men raced into the galley. Passengers froze in shock, realizing something far deadlier than turbulence was unfolding. Jessica drew her sidearm, keeping the muzzle low and her focus razor-sharp. One suspect, tall and menacing, met her gaze with open hostility. The other clutched a device that beeped ominously, wires dangling from a digital display. Jessica's chest tightened. It looked like a bomb. "Hands where I can see them," she ordered. In a split second, the tall man lunged for her weapon. She sidestepped, twisting his arm and slamming him against the bulkhead. Trays clattered and passengers cowered. Meanwhile, the second man stood trembling, device in hand, a flight attendant shrieking nearby. "Don't press that button," Jessica warned. He hesitated, voice cracking as he insisted, "It's fake, we were paid to do this." The beeping continued. Jessica wrested the device away, exhaling with relief when she recognized it as a sophisticated replica. "Call the pilot emergency landing," she said, flipping her badge into view. The tall man glared, pinned to the floor, the beeping device now safely in Jessica's grip. Across the aisle, Brian looked on in stunned silence, realizing the black woman he'd insulted was an undercover FBI agent protecting his life. As the cabin lights flickered, fear and relief rippled through the passengers. Jessica kept her weapon trained on the subdued men until other officials arrived. In that charged moment, far above the earth, justice eclipsed ignorance. The hate spewed at Jessica only hours before now stood powerless against her courage and expertise. After seizing the fake bomb, Jessica signaled the pilot for an emergency diversion. Flight attendants hurried to calm panicked passengers as the plane descended toward the nearest airport. The tall man, an 18D, still in zip-tie cuffs, glowered in subdued fury. Whatever scheme they'd planned had failed in midair. Once on the ground, law enforcement rushed aboard. The men were taken into custody, the phony device tagged as evidence. Passengers thanked Jessica, their wide-eyed relief tinged with awe. Brian, trembling in his seat, finally realized that the black woman he'd refused to sit beside was the very FBI agent who had saved them all. Humiliation and regret stained his features as he offered a feeble apology. Jessica, exhausted, only nodded. Some lessons were best learned in the stark light of a near disaster. Stepping off the plane, Jessica felt the weight of her duty and the triumph of justice, proving that prejudice falters in the face of true heroism. What began as a routine flight turned into an unforgettable ordeal. A racist passenger, fueled by ignorance, tried to belittle and demean a black woman, only to discover that she was the very FBI agent protecting everyone on board. Through unthinkable twists, a fake bomb plot, and a daring confrontation at 30,000 feet, justice prevailed. Yet the hardest-hitting lesson wasn't just for the would-be saboteurs, but for the prejudiced individual who realized too late the depth of his wrongdoing. Stories like this remind us that we share more in common than our differences suggest, and that true heroes can come from the most unexpected places. If you found this story gripping, inspiring, or thought-provoking, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful narratives that challenge assumptions and celebrate resilience. Thanks for watching, and stay vigilant out there.